Today is December 30th, 2022. This is my update for Russian military operations in and around Ukraine. And first and foremost, let's talk about this massive, probably the largest missile and drone strike so far since Russia began its special military operation in February 2022. Let's take a look at this BBC article. Russia fires 120 missiles from air and sea. Ukraine. And the article says an air raid alert has been issued across Ukraine as a fresh wave of Russian missiles targets major cities. Presidential advisor Podolyak said more than 120 missiles have been launched at the population and civilian infrastructure. While these missiles hit infrastructure all across the country, and they are targeting primarily the power grid, and they are knocking it out. It hits the capital, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkov, as well as Lvov, all the way in the west there. And then the BBC is citing all of these Ukrainian officials claiming how many missiles they intercepted. But then the article says dozens of Russian attacks have pounded Ukraine in recent weeks, causing repeated power cuts across the country. The mayor of Lvov said on Thursday that 90% of his city was without power. And then in Kiev, they said there could be fresh power and water cuts in the capital. Also in Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk. And so does that sound like they're intercepting all of these missiles and just a couple are sneaking through? Or does it sound like every time Russia launches these missiles and drone strikes, they are inflicting massive and permanent damage on Ukraine's power grid? In other words, they are achieving their objective each time they carry out these strikes. Obviously, Ukraine is able to intercept some of the missiles, but the claims of getting most of them, this is absurd. They clearly are not. I also want to point out the fact that the West and Ukraine, they have both repeatedly claimed that Russia is out of missiles. Their military industrial capacity could not possibly keep up with the demand required by these large-scale and frequent strikes, but very clearly they can, and they are. So keep this in mind when I start talking about fighting elsewhere in this conflict, and when I talk about Western analysts claiming Russia is running out of artillery. They've made this claim about artillery, and they've also made this claim about cruise missiles and drones before, and they clearly have been wrong before, and they most likely are wrong again this time. So let's talk about fighting elsewhere. Let's look at liveuamap.com. It is very pro-Ukrainian. If we take a look at the map, even at this time of recording this, you can see they're pretending that they've got their air defense systems knocking out all of these Russian missiles. The line of contact down here around Kherson and across Zaporozhye, that is relatively stable. The fighting continues to be focused around Bakhmut and a bit to the north around Soledar, and also toward the south. There's also fighting around Kremenna, and we've heard Ukrainian claims, not Ukrainian government or general staff claims, but across the Ukrainian social media networks, that they already took this city, and clearly they haven't, because even the pro-Ukrainian liveuamap.com is not indicating any territory changing hands, nor has the Ukrainian general staff, and they're both very inclined to report gains that they have supposedly made, even when they haven't. Now, regarding Bakhmut, I have gone over this before, and the reports continue to come in that Ukraine is pouring large numbers of troops and equipment into this battle, and they are losing huge numbers of troops and equipment fighting in this battle. They claim so is Russia, but they've also admitted that Russia outguns Ukraine somewhere around 6-1. So when you outgun someone by that much, you're most likely not suffering the same amount of losses in both troops and equipment. And I keep hearing Western analysts like Michael Kaufman in this interview from War on the Rocks, Localized Offensives, the Direction of the Conflict. This is actually an audio podcast. The link will be in the video description below. I keep hearing Michael Kaufman, who is cited regularly across the Western media. I keep hearing him claim that he doesn't really understand why Russia is so focused on Bakhmut. He claims that Russia will not be, even if they take the city, they will not be able to develop what he calls breakthrough momentum to sweep forward toward Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. But what if that's not what Russia is attempting to do? What if they're not interested in maneuver warfare offensives like that, and what they're actually interested in is a war of attrition and drawing in the best troops and equipment Ukraine has and eliminating it on a battlefield of their choosing, Bakhmut. That it seems to be exactly what they're doing. General Sergei Surovikin, overall commander of the operations in and around Ukraine, he has said that that's what they're doing. They're grinding down the Ukrainian military. This is not about territorial conquest. This is about eliminating their military. And once their military is irreversibly damaged, its troop levels, its equipment degraded to a certain extent, then Russia can take territory if that's what they're interested in doing. So this seems to be what's going on. And then this is what is the constant flaw in Western analysis of Bakhmut and the Russian special military operation overall. They keep citing a lack of territorial gains as some sort of indicator that their troops are not performing well. They don't have the equipment or ammunition that they need. And yet we're talking about, even on Ukraine's own side, admitting to the huge losses they're suffering in places like Bakhmut. Russia is clearly achieving their primary objective, which they've stated since late February, the demilitarization of Ukraine. That is what we're seeing here. Michael Kaufman admits that all of the resources and troops that Ukraine is pouring into Bakhmut to fight off the Russians, this is desperately needed for fighting in the immediate and intermediate future. And they're not going to have these men and these resources because they're spending it in Bakhmut right now. That is exactly Russia's plan. That is the plan, to diminish Ukraine's ability to develop its offensive potential anywhere else on the battlefield because it's being eliminated in Bakhmut. Kaufman also talks about Russian, so we're talking about Western analysts claiming Russia is going to run out of artillery rounds. And he makes it clear that it's not going to be as if Russia reaches a certain day and then they have no more rounds. Their military industrial capacity can create more artillery rounds. And I could almost guarantee you that they're making far more than the West can and will be able to for the foreseeable future. But he claims that they're going to run out of their stockpiles. They'll have to depend on only what they can produce, and this will drastically reduce their rate of fire. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I don't have the numbers sitting in front of me of Russian artillery shell production. What I do know is whatever Russia's problem is in obtaining artillery rounds to fire on the battlefield, Ukraine's situation is much, much worse. We know that for a fact. The West is admitting that this is a problem. And we keep hearing about reduced artillery fire, the rate of fire, and the inability of Russia to develop its offensive potential and go on the offensive and snatch up large tracts of territory quickly. We keep hearing this as an indicator that somehow they're losing their ability to stay in the fight. But again, if they're not trying to go on the offensive, if they are fighting a war of attrition and their only goal is to eliminate Ukrainian forces, then they seem to be achieving exactly what they want in Bakhmut and elsewhere. I've talked about this in previous updates. On a modern battlefield with two opponents who have modern weapons and well-trained forces, you cannot just rush across the battlefield. You will suffer huge losses. Kaufman, in his interview, even admits that Ukraine's offensive capability has been greatly diminished because of its own offensive around Kherson. This is when Ukraine sent huge numbers of troops and equipment into Russian defenses, trying to overwhelm them, and Russia just obliterating them. And now their offensive potential has been diminished. They have to regenerate it, if they can regenerate it. This is why Russia is not doing that, because they want to preserve their fighting capacity. They want to use that fighting capacity to wear down Ukrainian forces, not to seize territory, not at this point. We're also talking about Kremenna. I showed you on the map. This is toward the furthest extent Ukrainian forces made in their Kharkov offensive, and they also suffered huge losses, not as many, but very significant losses during that offensive. Their breakthrough momentum is gone. The question is, can they develop it again or not? But it is gone, and they are stuck around Kremenna. They have been trying to take it for months. I keep hearing about if Ukraine takes Kremenna, it'll cause a collapse of Russian defenses across the Donbas. I don't think that that's true. I think if Russian forces around Kremenna face encirclement or heavy casualties, they'll pull back just like they have been this entire time. The goal is to preserve your own fighting capacity and take out a huge toll on the enemy. And if Ukraine insists on advancing towards Kremenna out in the open, then Russia will be more than happy to oblige by destroying those forces while they're out in the open. However, what we do see Russia doing all across the line of contact is building very significant defensive positions, obstacles, trenches, fortifications of all kinds. This leads me to this New York Times article right here. Defenses carved into the earth. Russia is building a vast network of trenches, traps, and obstacles to slow Ukraine's momentum. Will it work? Well, before I show you the images and the diagrams in this article, which I think are very helpful, I just want to point out that Ukraine's momentum is already at a standstill. Again, the question is, can they go back on the offensive? Can they regain that momentum? But right now, they have no momentum. That is done. And this is what Russia is doing on top of that all. On top of stopping Ukraine's offensives around Kherson and Kharkov, this is what they're doing. So they show you this satellite image, and you can see layer after layer after layer of trenches, dragon's teeth. I'll get into what that is in just a moment if you don't know. More trenches, vehicle obstacles. And so you're looking at a possible direction of Ukrainian attack. So this is actually upside down. South is pointing up and north is pointing down. These are the layers of defenses that Ukrainian forces will have to get through. And you can also see, in addition to these very long and straight entrenchments, we have these zigzagging trenches, which I talked about in my previous video. They zigzag. Infantry are inside those trenches. If a direct hit from artillery or rockets or mortars hits, the zigzagging nature of the trench will contain the blast, and troops elsewhere in the trench system will be left unharmed. If we continue scrolling down, they show you the two areas where these defenses are being concentrated: Popasnya in the east and around Kherson. So we keep hearing about Ukraine wanting to take Crimea. Well, that's not going to happen if they have to pass defenses of that nature around Kherson. And they show you photographs of the dragon's teeth. So they're concrete pyramids and these tank traps, these deep ditches that a tank will fall into and not be able to get out of. Now, they have a very helpful cross-section illustration of these defenses. It's an oversimplification, but I think you get the idea. The tank would fall in here and not be able to get out, even if it somehow crossed this, and there are ways of doing that. They would have to face these dragon teeth, and then they would have to deal with these trenches where you have infantry, and they're in bunkers and pillboxes. This protects them from artillery and tank fire and other heavy weapons. And these infantry can have rifles and machine guns, but they could also have anti-tank and even anti-air weapons, man-portable systems. The New York Times says trenches are not new to Ukraine. Trench warfare has long been a feature of the battle in eastern Ukraine for the Donbas region. Ukrainians fight from their own trenches on their on their side of the line near Popasnia, where Russians are waging an intense campaign to dislodge Ukrainian troops from the city of Bakhmut. We were just talking about that. But the pace and the scale of Russian construction over the last couple of months is unmatched. So they're talking about unprecedented construction of defenses by either side. This is Russia doing this. This army we keep hearing about being in total disarray, disorganized, no resources, and yet they're creating these immense, unprecedented defensive fortifications. Just keep that in mind. All of these structures, they're talking about the image that I just showed you, the satellite image. All of these structures in the image above appeared within 6 days. The fortifications show how Russia's military is trying to set up more robust defensible positions against Ukrainian pressure, often with the help of natural obstacles like rivers. I would also like to mention they talk about the heavy equipment Russia is bringing in. So this is a well-resourced effort to do this. They have machines dedicated to digging these trenches in a very efficient and large-scale manner. The New York Times goes on and says, among the defenses are miles-long rows of concrete pyramids known as dragon's teeth. I showed you that. And deep ditches called tank traps. Both are designed to slow Ukrainian vehicles and force them into preset positions where Russian forces can target them all. And I will explain that much more clearly at the whiteboard in just a moment. Russia is also building miles of trenches and pillboxes, small structures for their troops to shoot from. And again, with rifles and machine guns, but also anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. And then it goes on about these are great but only if they're manned correctly. And then they talk about fresh recruits brought in during the mobilization. And as I pointed out many times, it was very clear that these are not fresh recruits. They are reservists. They have already served in the military, maybe not in combat. They've already done their service in the military. They have already been trained. They're being brought in, retrained, and sent into the theater of operation. So these are not fresh recruits. And so the chances of them being manned properly, this extensive defensive network being manned properly, are pretty high. Now, I want to talk about why Russia is building these defenses. This is not some last-ditch effort to stop Ukrainian momentum. Ukraine's momentum has already been broken. I want to explain how Ukraine goes on the offensive and why they do it the way they do, and what Russia does in response, and how these defenses are going to ensure that the next time Ukraine attempts to go on the offensive, especially anywhere where these defenses are being built, they will suffer even larger losses, more catastrophic losses. The primary unit Russia is deploying in Ukraine, the primary unit the Russian military is currently based around, is the Battalion Tactical Group. I've talked about this before. It is a unit between 600 to 800 strong, and it is heavily armed. It has main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, so armored force, self-propelled artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, mobile air defense systems. It has all of the heavy weapon systems, despite being such a small unit, under 1,000 men. All of the heavy weapon systems that a whole American division might have. The U.S. military is organized around brigade combat teams. These are much larger, and this goes for Ukrainian forces as well. Their brigades are much larger. It could be several thousand troops, and they will have armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and they will depend on dedicated units, other units, for artillery fire or tank support or air defense. Russian Battalion Tactical Group has everything all in one single unit under a single command. That's what makes it so powerful. So if you are Ukraine and you face this small but heavily armed unit that outguns you, outranges you, how do you close in and destroy it? So there is a paper that I have referenced before. I'm going to talk about it again. It's published by the U.S. Army, Fort Benning, Defeating the Russian Battalion Tactical Group by Captain Nicholas Fiore. And it says, although the Russian battalion group systems are technologically superior to the corresponding US equipment, the battalion tactical group doesn't have the capacity to observe, target, and attack the brigade combat team simultaneously across a broad front. So what he's saying is that the US brigade is larger, it could attack across a very wide front all at one time, and the Russian battalion tactical group, even though it has a huge amount of firepower, will only be able to concentrate that firepower in one direction or the other, allowing the other forces that are not being obliterated to close in on the battalion tactical group. This means obviously that you are going to suffer heavy, heavy losses trying to advance on a battalion tactical group. It cannot wipe out your entire brigade, but wherever it's pointing its guns, those forces are going to be destroyed. The paper also says, not only can the brigade combat team sustainably maneuver 3 times as many formations, the decentralized nature of a U.S. mission command allows each formation to maneuver simultaneously independent of brigade level direction. And we have seen Ukraine attempting to do this. They have the larger brigade, they break it down into smaller units, and they all try to maneuver independently toward Russian positions, attempting to evade any concentration of Russian firepower from these battalion tactical groups. And this, more or less, this is what Ukraine has been doing, and especially around Kherson, where Russian forces stood their ground with their battalion tactical groups, but also with a lot of other forces, creating almost division-level defenses, very large-scale defenses, far beyond just scattered battalion tactical groups in a particular area. And this is what Ukraine was sending wave after wave of men and machines into, and they were being destroyed. They were attempting to overwhelm Russian firepower, and there were, at certain junctures of the Kherson offensive, where they did force Russian forces to move back. And they moved back because they're risk adverse. They do not want to lose large numbers of troops. You see the battalion tactical group, all of that expensive, heavy equipment, they don't want to lose that. They would prefer to move back than to fight to the last very expensive piece of equipment and well-trained soldier. But considering how difficult it was for Ukraine around Kherson, even with Russia, its forces being isolated on the west bank of the Dnieper River, considering how much trouble they had. Now imagine these defenses that the New York Times is talking about. Imagine Ukraine having to cross these defenses as well as face that heavy firepower from multiple Russian battalion tactical groups behind these obstacles. Imagine how much more difficult that will be. Now, in order to explain to you this concept of creating a defensive position and channeling the enemy into a specific field of fire, I want to go to the whiteboard.
This is a basic example of infantry defensive positions of a fire team or a couple of fire teams. We're talking between 5, 10, maybe 15 soldiers in fighting positions. They could be fighting holes or some sort of basic trench. And this, obviously, this is the direction of potential enemy assault. So what do these infantry do besides dig these holes to try to provide themselves with cover while they fire back at the enemy? The enemy is obviously going to want to come down directly at them. It's the quickest, easiest way to approach these defensive positions, or maybe come in from different angles, but to go in a straight line, to minimize the amount of time they are on the battlefield in front of these guns. Now we have different types of guns here. I'm using US weaponry, and US weaponry when I was in the US Marine Corps. So we have the 240 Golf machine gun. It's 7.62 millimeter rounds, and the M16A2 service rifle, 5.56 millimeter rounds. You have the machine guns on these outer edges, and you have the M16s, the rifles in the middle. There's obviously a lot of other weapons I'm not including in here for the sake of simplicity. How do you get the enemy to stay on the battlefield in front of your guns longer? for as long as possible. You set up obstacles and barriers. You maybe make use of natural terrain that already exists. But absent natural barriers and obstacles, you create them using razor wire. And you set up the razor wire in two different ways. Tactical wire, which is to redirect the enemy assault into different directions or to slow them down if they decide to try to cross it. You also have protective wire, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is the last barrier between you and an approaching enemy, and it is to try to keep them out of your positions for as long as possible. You see how the tactical wire is spread out in front of these fighting positions in the fields of fire of these guns. So the machine guns are at the flanks, and their field of fire are going to cover this gap here in the tactical wire, and you're leaving that gap specifically to guide the enemy into the field of fire of this machine gun, and likewise this machine gun over here. So let's see what the enemy has to do to approach this fighting position, this defensive position. They want to go straight toward the enemy, minimize the amount of time they are on the battlefield in front of these guns, but they cannot because of this razor wire. So they either have to circumvent it like this, and you see for each turn and each distance traveled perpendicular to this fighting position means they are on the battlefield longer, taking that machine gun fire and that M16 rifle fire for a longer period of time. Or they have to try to circumvent and attack from the flanks. But look at where they are now. They are in the field of fire of these heavy machine guns. They likewise on this side. And again, you have this perpendicular distance being traveled, which means they are on the battlefield in front of your guns for a longer period of time. So considering this very basic example of an infantry fighting position, defensive position, and how they use this razor wire to redirect the movement of the enemy, to keep them on the battlefield longer, keep them in front of your guns longer. Imagine now going back to the New York Times article and talking about these massive and extensive defenses that Russia has created, these tank trenches to stop a tank from moving forward, the dragon's teeth, the trenches for infantry to occupy not just to fire machine guns and rifles, but also anti-tank weapons. If you consider all of that, it is meant to keep Ukrainian forces doing exactly this, trying to get around these obstacles, staying on the battlefield for a longer period of time in front of Russian guns, in front of that massive firepower contained within the Russian Battalion tactical group. That is the purpose of these defenses. This prevents Ukrainian forces from just speeding directly at a Battalion tactical group or operating across a broad front. They have to concentrate themselves to make it through the gaps that Russia leaves open, specifically to channel them into specified fields of fire. And instead of a machine gun, you have artillery, tank fire, rocket fire covering this area and at much longer ranges. And in the same way, you can direct Ukrainian forces through these obstacles, channel their forces into your fields of fire, and to keep them in front of your guns longer by creating these defensive positions across the entire line of contact. You are going to limit the options Ukrainian commanders have to launch offensive. They will see certain defensive positions that are much harder to breach than others, and it will create a short list of places Ukraine is most likely going to attack. And they can attack at a heavily fortified position, but they will run into significant defenses when they do that, and they will suffer significant losses when they do that.
So I hope that helps clear up why Russia is building these defenses and how they will use them. And you can see how this will greatly complicate any attempt by Ukraine or anyone else who wants to intervene in this conflict, how it will severely complicate any attempt to rush toward Russian positions. The Battalion tactical group, they're going to be behind these formidable layered defenses. And as advancing Ukrainian forces or potentially NATO forces, as they're trying to either go around these obstacles or cross over them, they are going to be in front of Russia's Battalion tactical group's guns for a longer period of time, allowing Russia to work their way through a much larger number of enemy forces before they're forced to withdraw. That is the whole point of this. And so going back to that interview by War on the Rocks with Michael Kaufman and talking about the direction this conflict is taking, it looks like Russia is setting the conditions to wage a war of attrition, to grind down Ukrainian forces and their infrastructure, especially their power grid, to grind them down and also deny Ukraine or its allies the opportunity to go on the offensive, to rush toward Russian positions and overwhelm their forces. Now they have to cross these defenses. They've got them in the east, key areas in the east, in the Donbas region, and also protecting the approach toward Crimea. Looking at how things are playing out on the battlefield, the way Russia is using attrition to grind down Ukrainian forces, how they're systematically dismantling Ukrainian infrastructure, and how their military-industrial capacity is ramping up while the US and its allies are running out of weapons and equipment to send Ukraine. We're almost a year into this conflict. Over the next year, I think all of these factors are going to start to accumulate, and we're going to see a very visible manifestation of this, especially for Ukraine, and it's going to be something that the Western media and Western politicians aren't going to be able to sidestep anymore. And then the question is, are they going to escalate? Are they going to attempt to bring other NATO forces, perhaps Poland, into the conflict? And maybe that's why Russia is building such extensive defenses, not necessarily to defeat what's left of Ukraine's military, but what Ukraine's sponsors might try to bring onto the field to salvage this. So we'll have to keep a close eye on this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my YouTube videos are automatically uploaded to Rumble and Odyssey. It might take a day or two, but they'll show up. Subtitles for my YouTube videos are auto-generated. They will eventually show up. Please give it about a day or two. All of the links that I referenced in this video are in the video description below, as are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel in any way. If you see an ad pop up, feel free to block it or skip it. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month-to-month donations, one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share my work, that is what has made this work possible over the last year. It's what will help make it possible throughout next year. So thank you again, and as always, thank you for watching.